Wow.
I like this quick tapping.
Yeah. Yeah, and thanks for the crew. You managed to find out the digits and bring in. That's great. Have you ever noticed that, of course we're dealing with joyful love today, but have you ever noticed that people aren't always on the same page as you when you want to rejoice? So for example, Billy Graham. Most people have been talking about the death of Billy Graham, and it's been, especially from the Christian worldview, it's been pretty positive about his life. That hasn't always been true. I was surprised at how many people just thought he's the incarnation of Satan himself. You know, because he didn't have their particular view on whatever. And so there was a huge amount of vitriol, just hate that was poured out on Billy Graham. And you know, here's a guy who impacted quite a few people over his life. So not everybody's on the same page. Here's a personal example. A couple of weeks ago, I used a couple of friends of mine, a couple of guys that I had worked with in the prison system, and one of those is Cass. And Cass is, you know, he's like all of us. He's on a journey. He's got some rough edges still, as we all do. And but boy, has God really made a big change in his life. Well, I get this text from a guy in Montana who's not on my friends list. And so if you have Messenger, just so you know, it kind of gets lost in the shuffle. You get this notification that somebody's trying to talk to you, and I don't know how long this email had been sitting there, or this text had been sitting there. So I click on it, and it's from a guy who had been married to Cass's girlfriend. They had 2 kids. One of them was his. She left him and shacked up with Cass in the midst of his drug addiction, and I mean, it got ugly. I mean, it got really ugly. And I think I shared with you, I went over to their apartment. They're both knocked out of their minds on drugs, and the kids are in the apartment. And it's just a bad situation. It was horrible. And Cass was the one who had turned her on to drugs and shooting her up with meth, or with opiates actually. And so it was ugly. Well, this ex-husband sends me this very unloving text, and just talking about how horrible Cass is and how horrible I am, and basically defending his ex-wife. Now remember, she ditched him and ran off with Cass, and she got involved in drugs, and things got really bad. She almost had her children taken away from her, and all of that was either my fault or Cass's fault. And how many ex-husbands defend their ex-wives who cheated on them and ran off on them? You know, do you see what I'm saying? And you kind of scratch your head and wonder at people who just think the way they do. Now, joyful love, that's all an intro into today, because joyful love is all part of a sermon series, and we've been using a book, Eats with Sinners, written by Aaron Chambers. And this week, go ahead and finish up the book, and I'll send out some questions this week just to help you through your devotional on it. But it's all built upon the premise, or upon 2 verses. We started this in Luke chapter 15, so go ahead and turn there. Verses 1 and 2. And I want you to meet some people who are very much like I just introduced. The folks who grumbled with Billy Graham and his life, and this ex-husband who's just not on the same page to God's victory in another's life. Luke chapter 15, verses 1 and 2. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to hear him. Tax collectors are, we don't like them today, and they liked them even less back in Jesus' day for a lot of reasons. They actually thought they were traitors. But also, just very clear, they're lumped in with sinners, and that's people who don't live a righteous, morally upright life. So you got those who, by the way, do we have anybody who's not a sinner in the room? Please raise your hand. Okay, so Jesus was hanging around with people like us. And the Pharisees and the scribes, oh, did you want to raise your hand? I'm not, yeah. That's, yeah. So, and the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled. Are you getting this? The Pharisees, we just love to shake our heads at them, don't we? Saying, this man receives sinners and eats with them. Now, what follows are three parables. This is a classic, this chapter, Luke 15, is a classic study in parables. Jesus responds to their grumbling, verse 2, with 18 more verses, 3 stories that just go right to the heart of what their problem was. And you know, you've heard them. As a matter of fact, the music was very much about that this morning. The first parable is the parable of the lost sheep. The second one is the parable of the lost coin. And the third one is the parable of the prodigal or lost son. Now, the reason it's a textbook study in parables is because all 3 parables go together. They build upon one another. There is a theme that is shared through all 3, but the real lesson is found in Luke 15, the parable of the prodigal son. Jesus, well, there's no nice way to say this. Jesus basically takes Gibbs' approach to, see, you like, do you really? I like you more and more. Yeah. So Gibbs, NCIS, would slap his subordinates up behind the head. And that's what Jesus does with the Pharisees. So he slaps them upside the head with this story. And I'll just go ahead and give you a heads up. The older son is their lesson in Luke 15, the parable of the prodigal son. So you got it. We're going to pick up at verse 11. We're going to skip the first 2 parables for now, and then talk about them in just a second. So Luke 15:11. And he said, there was a man who had 2 sons. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me. And he divided his property between them. Now, here's we're not going very far. We've got our first point. This younger son is a joy breaker. Do you have any joy breakers in your life? Do you have anybody who just breaks your heart? Life can be pretty good, but then somebody just pulls the rug out from underneath of you, and that's the younger son. What he culturally is saying to his dad is, Dad, I really like what you've got. I like it a lot, and I know it's going to be mine one day, but you know what? I'm just a little bit impatient, and I can't wait for you to die. So how would that go with your folks? If you went to them and you said, I'm really getting impatient, I'm wanting my inheritance, I'm a little afraid you're going to spend it all before I get to it, so would you just go ahead and give it to me now? Basically, I want you to die. And you will be dead to me at this point. That's what's going on with this younger son. He is breaking his father's heart. And, by the way, in all 3 parables, we're in there. And we're the joy breakers in God's heart. Because wanting what the Father has without having a relationship with the Father is God's textbook definition of what sin is. You've always heard I is the middle letter in sin, so the root of sin is I. That's great, and it works great in English, except the Greek word for sin is hamartia. So there's no I in the middle of hamartia. So it's a little, It's a little ethnocentric, don't you think? We're a little too filled with ourselves. The real issue of sin is, God, I want everything you've got. I want to do what I want to do. I like what you've got, but I really don't want you in my life. That's sin. And that's what this son is doing. But now, let's ask this big question. Do you have a prodigal in your life right now? Is there somebody in your life that just is breaking your heart, that you really want them to come to the Lord? And they're on the outskirts. Be in prayer for that. Over the course of these 8 weeks, we've written down 8 names. And you have plenty of room to write down multiple names of folks who are just in that category. So just a reminder, who is your prodigal? Verse 13. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into the fields to feed pigs. This is a Jewish boy. He's off feeding pigs. Pigs are unclean. We like it more southern. We like southern barbecue, and it's not barbecue unless it's pork, right? Pork fat rules. But they didn't have the same mindset in Jewish times. You know, pork is a no-no. And here this kid is. Things have gotten so bad, he's wasted all the money, he's feeding pigs. Verse 16. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. Have you ever been that broken? Have you been to the bottom of whatever proverbial pit you've dug for yourself? And, I mean, things are pretty bleak. By the way, that is also a picture of us. Because we generally are, this sin issue that we have, wanting what the Father has without wanting the Father, doesn't really get real until we're broken and we're at the bottom of the pit, we're in a crisis, and guess who we start to call out for? God. And that's why prison ministries are so effective. That's why drug addiction programs are so effective for evangelism. That's why hospital ministry is so effective for evangelism. Because generally we're not willing to accept God or to acknowledge God when things are good. We suddenly get very attentive when things are going badly. And so here I introduce you to joy fakers. That's all these things that just steal our heart from God. And there's plenty of them in this world, aren't there? I mean, there are joy fakers that he wanted to live the high life. He wanted to enjoy things. He wanted to take this money because he was smarter than his dad, and he just wanted to do his own thing. Aren't we like that? But the problem with those sort of temporary things is they're fakes. It's building this apartment for my mom, I've got a lot of construction stories. So it's a little like putting caulking on trim. You can't help but get some of the caulk on your hands. And then once it's on your hands, you can't get rid of it. So then you have to be careful. Suddenly your elbows become extra hands because you can't touch the wall because you've got the caulk on your hands, or glue, or whatever it might be, or paint. My wife is a meticulous painter. This is not true of her. It is true of me. But somehow all this nastiness gets on you, and that's the case of sin. But it gets worse than that. Go ahead, next screen. See. Turn off the lights. There you go. Well, can you see it? See the rope around the neck? This is water. And so here's the poor sinner who's being dragged down. There's a rope around his neck, and that's actually a giant millstone. I mean, it's a great picture of just that bottom of the barrel, bottom of the pit. And that's where this young man is. He's eating what the pigs don't eat. He's working with a contrary, nasty animal according to his culture. He's wasted all his money. There's nothing for him. And it's no secret as to what happens next. Okay, put the lights back on. Verse 17. But when he came to himself, and that's an interesting phrase, when he came to his senses, basically, is what it's saying. He said, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. And he arose and came to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion, and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to, what's the word? Celebrate. Now his older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing, and he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. That should be a clue into his personality, by the way. A little bit of a control issue. Verse 27, and he said to him, your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he was received him back safe and sound. You would be happy, right? Verse 28. But he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him. But he answered his father, look, these many years I have served you, and I never disobeyed your command, yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him. Is he in a good place? No. And that's why you have the joy takers. Do you know any joy takers in your life? You know, those are, you go into a, here we are, we're celebrating. And it's just like those two stories I told you before the sermon. You get into the room, and there are some people that just suck every bit of joy out of the room. Do you know anybody like that? Yeah, we're nodding our heads. Evan, he just, by the way, Evan just turned 11. Everybody say happy birthday. Yeah. So yeah, there are some people, I mean, they just, they're just no fun. Verse 31, and he said to him, son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad. For this, your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. By the way, the joy takers, that's the third and final parable. It's the big difference in the three parables. And guess who is pictured here? Who's the joy takers? Yeah, the Pharisees, the scribes. They're taking and looking at who Jesus is hanging around with, and they're saying, this just ain't cool. And so, what are some of the signs you might be a joy taker? You beat yourself up over every little mistake, but then you also beat up others. You find it really difficult to praise someone. You always jump to focus on faults rather than the good things people have done. You regularly tell people what they should and shouldn't do. People have told them that you make them feel as if you can never do anything right. When it comes to other people's appearances, homes, or lifestyle choices, you often will give them paragraphs of commentaries on what they could improve to your liking. Are you a joy taker? Your parents were super critical when you were growing up, or I should say, a parent or some adult or some authority figure. You can't help but notice that people stop feeling motivated when you work with them. Are you a joy taker? You follow people around to fix what they don't do correctly. Your friends have called you overly critical. People are generally afraid to be themselves around you. Was that the Pharisees? Yeah. But I think there's a lot of overly critical people today. People have called you a bully or abusive before. And then finally, this is the Pharisees. You have a holier-than-thou attitude. So, can we become like the Pharisees? Yes, we can. We can take it, look at God's victory in somebody's life, and we can just suck the joy out of the room and just poo-poo what's going on. You know, you hear statements like, oh, they don't really mean it. They're not going to change. It's not going to happen. You're going to write them off. You're a joy taker. Do you know somebody like that? Or worse yet, are you like that? But, we want to rejoice right here. For we've got the joy maker. Did you see him? Let's go on. Verse 7. Let's jump back to the first parable. Notice how it wraps up the first parable. Just so I tell you, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. Thank you, Sam, for your music choice this morning, because that was spot on. Notice how we write about these parables, and we even sing these songs. So we have Chain Breaker by Zach Williams. We have the song that Sam introduced for us this morning. Remember When Mercy Came Running by Phillips, Craig, and Dean? It tells the same story. And how much we're in love with that. How much we just adore this aspect of God, that He is a joy maker. But look at verse 10. Just so I tell you, there is joy before the angels of God over one sinner who repents. What's the common theme through the three parables? The closer you get to God, the more it's like a party. Have you noticed that? The closer you get to God, the more confetti is being thrown. The closer you get to God, the more you hear angels singing. The farther you are from God, the more complaining you hear. The more criticism. The more poo-pooing. The closer poo-pooing. It's a Greek term. Yeah, no, it's truly poo-pooing. Yeah. So it's one of those words. But really, we do this, don't we? But when you pull away from being human and you get close to God, He's throwing a party. I mean, He wants to celebrate, doesn't He? I mean, God is crazy in love with us. So let's look at what brings God joy. When one sinner repents, more than 99 who don't need fixing. Or at least they think they don't need fixing. What brings God joy? When the lost are found. When the dead return to life. Notice how Jesus paints the picture of God. In all three stories. He just paints this great picture of God's joy at the lost coming back to Him. Also, keep in mind, God doesn't seem to care what the son did. The older son points out the sin. But the father is just saying, hey, he was dead. He's back to life now. Did he know he was with prostitutes? Yeah. Apparently the word got back. I'm thinking you pay attention to those sort of things. But what was God concentrating on? The son was back. Those close to God cannot help but join in the celebration. And that's when you see, if you're looking for a church, that's what you really want to look for. If they're uptight and closed off and controlling, you will probably want to avoid that congregation. But if they're a church of joy, and they're celebrating, and you find I love what it says in Acts chapter 2, verses 42 and following. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. And everyone was filled with a sense of, what's that word? Oh, there's a party happening. And so that's what's going on when you get close to God. One of the great things about God's love is his long-suffering compassion. But here's the biggie. And I told somebody this morning they were going to be in the sermon, so you're going to find it. Somebody from this congregation actually called a visitor riffraff. I'm just so brokenhearted. So I told them they would be in the sermon because guess what God fills his banquet halls up with? He fills them up with riffraff and not the righteous. And that's the great beauty of God's love, isn't it? Verse 20. And he arose and came to his father. But while he was still, what? A long way off. I don't know where you are right now. And you could be a long way off in your journey with God. Maybe you're coming back. Maybe you haven't even started the journey. But this tells you the story of God's compassion. You know, or about those that we love and we want them to know Jesus while they're a long way off. God's paying attention. And he wants to celebrate. You got it? So while he was a long way off, his father saw him and felt what? Compassion. And ran and embraced him and kissed him. As we were sharing our ideas for this sermon, it was great. It's actually been a blessing to work with other ministers because, you know, we share ideas, we bounce things off of each other, and ideas get refined, and it's just been wonderful. So the idea for the Joy Breaker, Joy Taker, and Joy Maker came up, but also the suggestion for this song, Chain Breaker, came up, and everybody just responded to it. Boy, did they respond to it. But one guy shared a phenomenal story that I just have to share with you. Remember those 8 names that we've been writing down? And what I'd like for the men to do, or for the crew to do, because I don't want to be misogynistic. So if you'll get up and you'll pass these out, these are refrigerator magnets. So you take the names from your paper plates and you put those names on here. If you don't have those, then here's what I want you to do. Your home is supposed to be the one in the center. What I'd like for you to do, go ahead and pass them out to everybody. There should be enough for definitely every household, but maybe enough for everybody in the room. Ideally, the way this is supposed to work is your home is in the center, and then you've got all these houses that are around you. You can, at the very, very least, put your neighbors there, and I want you to start praying for them. I want you to bless them by beginning nothing more than prayer. Put this up on your refrigerator. And I want you to think about your neighbors or your friends or those people that you've put on those lists. I want you to think about them on a regular basis. Just start the prayer. Now, next, we're going to start outreach. We're going to start working in their lives, and that doesn't mean invite them to church. No, it means intersecting in their lives. But we'll cover that in the weeks that follow. Keep in mind, in just a month, we're going to hit the big one, and that's Easter. On April Fool's Day this year, by the way. Now, for some of you, that person or the persons that are on there may be in your household. So it might be kind of funky if you're putting up on your refrigerator their name, there's a, why is my name on here? Why are you praying for me? So you might want to put it someplace in that situation, put it someplace that they don't see, but you see on a regular basis. You got it? Because while they're a long way off, we want to have the same sort of compassion that God has for them. You got it? So here's the story. It's a story of a woman who did this very thing. How far is a long way off? There were two women, one older and one younger. And one woman 20 years earlier had met this second woman. And she was outside of Christ. She didn't know Christ. And so she became a regular focus of the first woman's prayers. Finally, after 20 years, the younger woman responded by somebody else's interaction. All the first woman had been doing was just praying for this woman for 20 years. Here, 20 years. Say that, 20 years. And they show up at a women's Bible study together at the church of my friend. And they sit down next to each other. And it comes time for prayer. And so the first woman, the older woman, opens up her Bible, and she has listed there just what we're talking about here. She sees a list of names that this woman has been praying for years in this worn, tattered Bible. And it's a long list that this woman had been praying for. And sitting right next to her, this younger woman looks over and sees the fourth name down is her own. That ended up in victory. She came to Christ because of that. See, if we're going to be joy makers, we have to be as perseverant as God and do this while they're a long way off. So this is a tool. There will be more, but even if you're just visiting with us today, I'd like for you to use them because it's the first step in making an impact on somebody else's life. Let's end with this. Right now is our altar call. Now I want to play on the words a little bit. Altar, in our tradition, and that's within our churches, we're not big on altar calls. Because number one, where is the altar? There's not one up here, right? Yeah, the altar is in our heart. That's where God's sacrifice takes place. So we're not big on altar calls, but we are big on altar, A-L-T-E-R, an alteration of our heart, a transformation.